U.S. prepares for a second round of peace talks in Pakistan. The president says he feels no pressure to reach a deal. NTV's White House correspondent Mario Tsu brings us the details.
They got a little cute as they have been doing for 47 years. Nobody ever took them on. We took them on. They have no Navy. They have no Air Force. They have no leaders. They have no nothing.
President Trump declaring he's winning the war by a lot, saying that the Iranian regime's Navy has been completely wiped out. Their Air Force has gone onto darker runways. They have no anti-missile and anti-airplane equipment. Their former leaders are mostly gone. And he adds, perhaps most important of all, the blockade, which we will not take off until there is a deal, is absolutely destroying Iran. They are losing $500 million a day, an unsustainable number even in the short run. This comes as Vice President J.D. Vance and top U.S. officials are expected to depart for Islamabad, Pakistan for a second round of peace talks ahead of the Wednesday ceasefire deadline.
The outcome of these talks will be incredibly consequential, and as the president has stated, he is prepared to escalate, to de-escalate. He is prepared to actually board and turn around Iranian ships, even as far east as the Pacific Ocean.
President Trump saying he's under no pressure whatsoever to make a deal, as he's drawing a distinction between Operation Epic Fury and the length of previous military conflicts, saying, quote, I'm not going to let them rush the United States into making a deal that is not as good as it could have been. This comes as the president threatens to knock out Iran's bridges and power plants after he says the regime violated the ceasefire agreement by firing bullets into the Hormuz Strait.
During the conflict, Iran did everything they could to interrupt the flow of everyone's traffic through there. It's the only card they have. But that card is slipping out of their hands, and they know it. So no, right now we are on maximum pressure campaign on Iran.
Overnight, CENTCOM announcing that U.S. forces seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman after it tried to breach the U.S. naval blockade. The Department of War saying American forces acted in a deliberate, professional, and proportional manner to ensure compliance. Since the blockade's commencement, U.S. forces have directed 25 commercial vessels to turn around or return to an Iranian port. Meanwhile, President Trump declares the deal he's making with Iran will be, quote, far better than the JCPOA, known as the Iran nuclear deal, which he says was a guaranteed road to a nuclear weapon. The president says that this new deal will guarantee peace, security, and safety not only for Israel and the Middle East, but also for Europe and America. Reporting from the White House, Mario Tsu, NTV News.
The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is expected to expire Wednesday evening, and President Trump is indicating it's highly unlikely that he'll extend it. Meanwhile, Vice President J.D. Vance is traveling to Pakistan for another round of negotiations with Iran. To break down the latest on this conflict, we welcome on our panel Jonathan Gilliam, former Navy SEAL and former FBI Special Agent, and Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, Senior Fellow at the National Security at the Family Research Council. Thank you both very much for coming back on the show. Over the weekend, the U.S. military seized an Iranian cargo ship that tried to bypass the U.S. naval blockade. On Friday, Iran's foreign minister announced that the Strait of Hormuz was completely open. The next day, the IRGC declared it closed. Colonel, considering what appears to be internal division of leadership in Iran, how successful can this new round of negotiations with J.D. Vance be?
Well, it really depends upon who the Iranians send to Islamabad. You know, they sent a 71-person delegation last weekend, but they didn't have the authority to make a decision. And so, you know, Vance left. He left on the table, you know, their best and final offer. Obviously, it wasn't final because we're going back again. But after, you know, the ceasefire appears to be in name only because of the exchange of fire in the Gulf in the last day, we find that, you know, there's a necessity to talk, but, you know, I don't know that we have any great confidence that we're going to get anything out of this round as much like the last round of discussions in Islamabad.
And Jonathan, President Trump says that Iran violated the ceasefire by firing at commercial vessels and reclosing the strait. Is a deal with Iran possible, considering how fragmented their leadership is?
Yes, well, first of all, this ceasefire, as the Colonel was saying, has been weak at best. I mean, the reality is they just stopped firing, but the game of maneuvering has not stopped. And I think seizing that vessel and along with these next round of talks, every little thing that we do blockade or enforce our rules for the way that we want it, which really very few people have ever stood up to Iran in this way. But also, this next round of talks will give the president, I believe, tremendous intelligence and assurance of who's in charge and who's not. And I think that's going to be a big part of this is when they step back to the table, as we were discussing, you know, the individuals that were there last time didn't really have the authority to make a deal. So are there going to be different people there this time, or are they still sending the same useless people? Because ultimately, that shows us that they're really not interested in negotiations. But it also does help us validate and verify any chatter that they may have after that, and who's talking and who's making the real rules of how they're going to act and react.
And even if they do send someone a little bit more competent, who's to say that they're competent enough to enforce such a deal across all of Iran? But I want to go into sort of a parallel of what we've seen over the past few months here. Following a U.S. military operation in Venezuela, the U.S. now has direct access to Venezuelan oil and oversight of its revenue from the oil while working to rebuild their infrastructure. Now we have the U.S. military controlling the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, stopping Iranian oil exports and revenue. President Trump said in his social post today referencing the Iran operation.
It's stupid.
This is being perfectly executed on the scale of Venezuela, just a bigger, more complex operation. The results will be the same. Now, Jonathan, can President Trump do to Iran what he did with Venezuela?
Well, I think what he did in Venezuela is a part of what he's doing with Iran right now. I think all this plays into effect whether or not it was a strategic plan for both of those things to happen the way that they did. I don't know. The president knows that. But I will say that if I was on the planning group and I thought, what's the best way to ensure that any movements we have against Iran were to be successful, I would have said we need to free up the oil in Venezuela first. So that people have an option other than Iran, and I think it's worked out perfectly. So, I think the way this president is running the military, the way he understands each particular part of its use, and how far it can be extended and to keep us from getting drawn into something, I think he's done an amazing job. I haven't seen leadership like this in my lifetime, and I would venture to say since World War II, where we have a commander-in-chief who is working so closely with the military in a way that he just understands tactics versus strategy and strategic planning versus tactical operations. It's a very amazing thing to watch.
Colonel, why is this operation in Iran much more complex than in Venezuela, where all it took was capturing Maduro to gain control, essentially, of their government and oil?
Yeah, Venezuela was really a police action, a model of going after drug traffickers and sanction enforcement. Very different than what we've seen in Iran. Iran, obviously we have a strategic choke point, Strait of Hormuz, 20% of the world's oil, and it's really got the entire world, paying a lot at the pump. Also, state-on-state conflict. There's a lot of shooting. Now, it's not the ground type. As I was accustomed to as an infantry officer, but you're shooting things from the air, you're firing missiles, and so it's state on state. And then military confrontation. The Iranian navy's at the bottom of the drink. A lot of their, what's left of the Air Force is piles on runways around that country. So you really have a tete-on-tete here, which is very serious. And I don't think the parallel is good. The planning was marvelous on both sides, but I think they're very different types of conflicts.
And President Trump says that he would work with Iran to recover its stockpile of enriched uranium, what he calls nuclear dust. Much of that from after the operation where B-2 bombers took out much of their plants and buried it deep underground. Here's a former Assistant Defense Secretary under Obama discussing what such an operation of getting that nuclear material might entail.
You would need to set up in the middle of the country a secure perimeter. It would probably take thousands of U.S. troops to facility while our experts excavated the HEU that's located inside deep tunnels at a place called Isfahan.
Colonel, is an operation of this scale possible, and could it possibly escalate the conflict?
Yeah, well, there are so many pieces to this. Recovery means obviously excavating a bombed out facility, taking excavation equipment in there, and the HEU is in small containers, relatively small containers. So they're probably somewhere like 20 containers across 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium. And then, of course, you have to transport it out of Iran. Operationally, it takes a lot of people to secure it, and then to excavate it. Then you have to treat it. Obviously, highly radioactive debris and partially enriched uranium is not something you want to mess around with. So you have to have a lot of people on hand that know what they're doing. So radiological risks, security risks, verification problems, Iranian resistance, perhaps, and in the middle of a war zone. It's not a pretty sight. Not sure how this is going to be done, given that we, at this point, don't have anybody that we think we can trust.
Jonathan, anything to add there?
Well, I think the one good thing about that is that it would be an operation to recover and then get out of there, which is different than occupying like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, hunting an elusive, invisible enemy. And I think that's a big difference is if we know where this actual hard location is at, then that is the one thing that does play in our benefit is it doesn't lead necessarily to a long-term occupation of a space. If they can take it over and we can get in there and somehow find and locate this stuff and go through what the colonel the process that he just explained, which is difficult at best, perhaps we can get in, get it, and get out. But I think that's going to be the only one good thing is that it's not a plan to occupy that location. It's a plan to recover that material, which would make it a little bit different than what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But again, I'll say that what we did in Venezuela and the way we worked so far is that the president has not allowed himself to be drawn into things that we don't need to be in. And so I think if he's thinking that way and he has the right people that are advising him and the right plans, I think it could be done. It just would be something that we have not done before, but it's something that I think is possible of happening.
And the goal of this operation, of course, is to make sure that Iran can never develop a nuclear weapon. But Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis and Jonathan Gilliam, thanks so much for joining with us and sharing your insights and expertise. Really appreciate it. And now you're looking at a live shot of the U.S. Capitol building where lawmakers are investigating 11 missing or dead scientists. Why Congressman James Comer is saying it could be a, quote, grave threat to national security.